Fox's own Leland Vitter on the ground in Libya. He was about to conduct an interview when a hail of gunfire went off all around him. He's fine. In today's United Kingdom Independent, a newspaper over there, a report says that America has a secret plan to arm Libyan rebels as they continue to battle pro-Gaddafi forces. And today, President Obama, as you heard, publicly said NATO, of which the United States is, of course, a major part, is considering military options in Libya. My next guest says that would be a bad idea. Joining me now is Jack Hunter, columnist for the American Conservative magazine. Jack, it's a pleasure. Welcome here.
Good to be with you, George.
Big picture, before we even get to Libya, is there any conflagration or conflict anywhere on the planet that the United States doesn't claim it has an interest in the outcome of and has the ability to resolve to its liking?
Well, that's the problem, Judge. So often we can find maybe feasible reasons to get involved here or there, to do this or that, but they always come back to bite us. If we will remember, before this uprising in Libya, who were we supporting? The guy they're rising against. We saw it in Egypt. We supported Mubarak, and of course they rose against him. And the people there who are rioting, who are upset, who are protesting, have long memories. They remember that. And I think there was a report in the UK Guardian last week where some Libyans were saying, well, if Turkey were to help us, they're a Muslim nation, we will accept that. But if the Americans even try, we will fight them in the streets like they did in Iraq.
Why do you think the president even made a suggestion, which of course has captivated all of us since he said it a few hours ago, that NATO is considering military action? I mean, this is not going to scare Gaddafi. He's a madman. I assume the president is serious or he wouldn't have said it. What does he think he can accomplish here?
Well, of course he's serious, and he's not unlike his predecessor and the president before that. That is American foreign policy. The world looks to us to see what is America going to do. Why? Because America always does something. The problem is we never stop and examine whether that's a good idea or in our national interest or defense. That's something we need to stop and really reassess.
Is the Obama administration working with Saudi Arabia to supply arms and aid to the Libyan rebels?
It would make sense. They're our allies.
What would happen if there's a riot or a revolt like this in Saudi Arabia? Not as likely to happen, but what would we do?
Well, a lot of people we know would love to intervene, and any excuse will do to make that happen. Let's look at what we did in Afghanistan throughout the 80s, the horrors that were visited upon the Afghan people by the Soviets. What did we do? We aided them with weapons. There's been a debate whether they still use Stinger missiles that we gave them on us, on our troops today. It came back to haunt us. So let's say we do the same thing in Libya now, that we aid them, whether through Saudi Arabia or anybody else. What kind of regime is going to come out on top? Are they going to be friendly to us? Is that going to be a good idea?
What should we do with Libya? From the libertarian, leave well enough alone, let's trade with everybody argument, an argument we both share. What would you advise the American government to do today with respect to what's happening?
The lesson we learned in Iraq is that you can't give people freedom. They have to win it on their own. And that's what we're seeing in Libya. If it's a genuine democratic revolution, let them win it on their own. It always gets us into trouble when we try to intervene, even for benevolent reasons. I know a lot of people's hearts are in the right place, but it always comes back to haunt us every single time.
Didn't you think it a little strange that over the weekend, Secretary Gates made a couple of statements? He said a no-fly zone is extremely costly. First, you have to destroy their anti-aircraft weaponry on the ground. Then you have to destroy all their aircrafts. Then you have to occupy the space over the country. This country's about the size of Texas. That's not something we can do overnight. And then 2 days later, the president says, we're thinking of doing something militarily.
Well, it shows that our defense secretary is a thoughtful man who has been there, done that, experience with all this sort of stuff. And he told, I think, the audience at West Point that somebody would need to have their head examined, the future defense secretary, who would have a large-scale invasion and occupation like we had in Iraq. And he said, for example, if we have a no-strike zone, let's just call a spade, to quote the defense secretary. That means that we have to strike militarily. He warned against that based on our past experience.
Jack Hunter, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's good to be here, Judge.
Americans are innocent until proven guilty, right? Apparently it doesn't work that way with the military. Private First Class Bradley Manning has been accused of leaking sensitive documents and videos that allegedly compromised our national security and certainly embarrassed many high-level American officials and politicians in the past year. These are the documents Julian Assange and WikiLeaks famously made public. Private Manning is currently being held in a military brig where he reportedly was stripped of all of his clothing so as to keep him from hurting himself. He's even made to stand at attention in front of others, totally unclothed. With us here to discuss this is a woman who is no stranger to being imprisoned for political reasons. Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Judith Miller. Judy, welcome here. I don't think they treated you the way they treated him, and you weren't in a military prison.
You'd have every journalist and every news organization in the country screaming, what is going on here, had I been treated that way. And I find it hard to believe that the military is now making excuses, rather lame excuses, according to what I've read, for the treatment of Bradley Manning.
All right, even in the military, the military must follow the Constitution, at least the basic parts.
Well, one hopes so.
Right. One is innocent until proven guilty. He hasn't even been formally charged yet.
Well,
he hasn't even had what's called an Article 32 hearing, which is the equivalent of a grand jury. He's just had some prosecutors file charges, which were changed as recently as last week. Yet he's kept in isolation 23 hours a day.
Yes.
Now he's being kept naked all the time. Originally he was allowed to wear underwear and flip-flops until he kiddingly said, I might beat myself to death with my flip-flops, so they took those away.
Right, or he might use the elastic band in his underwear to strangle himself. And apparently he said that as a jest, but the military used it as an excuse to make sure that he didn't have that opportunity.
Why do you think the military is doing this to him?
You know, I don't know. This is conduct really unbecoming our American military. This is the kind of thing that if you read about it in a foreign country, you'd say, well, you see, that's what happens when you don't have a Bill of Rights. And it's hard to understand. Now, what he is accused of doing has endangered American sources and American military personnel overseas. Of course, that's the way the military thinks of this, and I suppose the assumption is anything goes, but I don't think that's the standard we want for our military or our country.
He's in a jail with people who've been charged with rape and charged with murder, and the evidence of their guilt is whatever it is. It's sufficient to charge them. They're not being tormented this way. They're not slowly being driven crazy by this solitude and nakedness and utter humiliation in the presence of strangers.
I mean, I think one of the toughest things, Judge, is solitary itself. Not being able to really talk to somebody. At one point the military said, well, he can talk to people. He can talk to his lawyer. He can talk to visitors on the weekend. But for 23 hours a day, not to have anyone to talk to, to have human companionship is really very, very tough.
Do you think Julian Assange may end up somewhere in an American jail cell, even though, you and I have talked about this, the Pentagon Papers, that famous Supreme Court decision in the mid-'70s, protects his publication of this information?
I would hope that he wouldn't be. I mean, he is now in Sweden, and Sweden is going to do whatever it's going to do with respect to the charges of rape against him. But is it clear that the United States wants to make an issue of this, wants to make a big issue of it? It is a big issue, and what he has done, what Bradley Manning did, is reprehensible. Julian Assange, Judge, as you and I may continue to disagree, is in a totally different category. He is a journalist, and his job is to disseminate information that the government doesn't want you to have.
Judy Miller, it's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.
And now a few items from our Freedom File. Since Congress and President Jimmy Carter created the Federal Department of Education, the quality of education in this country has deteriorated. In fact, since this unconstitutional federal government power grab, the inflation-adjusted cost of education per student has almost doubled, and performance has fallen drastically. But today, according to Reason magazine, the federal government funds 82 distinct programs to improve teacher quality. Does anyone seriously think that any one of these programs are helping America's schools? Of course not. But will it raise more of your tax dollars? You bet. This is yet another reason that we need to get the feds out of education and the government out of schools. Only when there's competition for your education dollar will schools improve and will the dollar be spent wisely. And is there anything that government won't regulate? A bill recently introduced in the New York State Legislature would require people to register their bicycles, of all things, with the state of New York. This in the name of safety. But don't be fooled, this is just another government shakedown in the form of forcing people to pay licensing fees for their bicycles. A Democratic lawmaker in my home state of New Jersey proposed a similarly ridiculous bill there a few months ago, only to back down after her fellow Democrats said we can't support this. But can anyone give a reasonable argument for requiring bikes to be registered? No, of course not. This is government wanting more of your money and more power for itself. Pure and simple. There are two more incidents that prove still that the TSA can't be trusted with keeping travel safe, despite its unconstitutional and perverted methods. Recently, box cutters were found on a flight leaving New York City. And a TSA agent by the name of Moneta Walker was arrested for helping a suspected drug dealer avoid security in Buffalo. These stories of TSA corruption and incompetence are a seemingly daily occurrence. If it's not enough to disband the TSA for its obscene, degrading, and rights-trampling tactics, can we at least agree that its incompetence is enough to justify its end? Of course we can. The airlines should be responsible for their own safety. They have the most to lose. They have competition. And they're interested in enhancing your travel freedom, not restricting it. When they were selling Obamacare, they didn't tell us Medicare costs 4 times more than private health insurance. So how much more will the new health care law put us in the red? We have the ugly facts. Next.